While disagreement about ethics is widespread, there is one claim about ethics that should be relatively uncontroversial. Ethics is challenging. Now, there are a variety of reasons why it is challenging, but ultimately, I think ethics is challenging because it challenges us as persons. Being an ethical person can test your will to do the right thing and even your ability to know what the right thing is. Ethics challenges us because life is complex. Our perspective is limited, and human nature is replete with weaknesses and frailties that we constantly need to work to overcome. This is why there's so many difficult ethical situations that can leave us thinking, I can't decide what should be done, or, if I were in that situation, I don't think I could muster enough strength to do the right thing. In this video, I'm going to explore this issue of why ethics is challenging, why it's difficult, why it challenges us as persons, by looking at the difference between moral and ethical dilemmas. And the goal of the video is going to be to understand how these moral and ethical dilemmas arise and how we can better respond to them. To begin, we should start by offering a provisional definition of the difference between a moral dilemma and an ethical dilemma. The author of our textbook, Lisa Newton, describes a moral dilemma or a moral problem in the following way. She says, in a moral problem, we know what is right, but we may have very good reasons not to want to do it. Or we may be puzzled about the right way to say no, or the best means to obtain the best outcome. Additionally, we may be tempted to preserve our level of comfort by doing nothing at all. Now, what is the point she is making here about a moral dilemma? When you are facing a moral dilemma, you're facing a specific kind of challenge to your character. The challenge isn't primarily about knowledge, right? In a moral dilemma, the challenge isn't primarily knowing what the right thing to do is. If you are honest with yourself, and it may be difficult to be honest with yourself in this situation, but if you're honest with yourself, then the idea is you know what the morally correct thing to do is. The issue you're having and the challenge you're facing is that you are having a very difficult time making yourself do it or finding a way to do what you know is the best moral option to proceed with. And as an example, she gives the previously discussed case that we talked about of the impaired driver case. So recall the impaired driver case. Here we have someone who causes an accident in a parking garage, and they're deciding, do I call the cops and go through the accepted procedures, or do I simply leave the scene of the accident? And after weighing up all the various factors, at least the evaluation that Newton comes to is that you know deep down that the right thing to do is to call the police, own up, and take responsibility for what you have done. Of course, you know that doing this will cause you a lot of personal hardship to your career, to your family, and potentially lead to fines or jail time. So the issue here in the impaired driver case isn't so much what is the right thing to do, but the issue is, do you have the strength of character? Do you have the strength of will to in fact do what you already know is correct? That is fundamentally what characterizes a moral dilemma. And as Newton suggests here, one of the main obstacles in the way of acting in the correct manner when it is difficult to do so is temptation. In the impaired driver case, we are tempted to think about ourselves. We are tempted to do what is unjust to avoid the difficult consequences that we would face if we in fact took responsibility for our actions. So in a moral dilemma, we're talking about a case where you know what is right, but you're simply tempted to do the wrong thing, and you're having a difficult time following through on what you know would be virtuous. Now let's contrast this with an ethical dilemma. In an ethical dilemma, the challenge you are facing is somewhat different. Now, an ethical dilemma could also be a moral dilemma, right? If we have an ethical dilemma, it might be the case that even if you knew what the right thing to do is, that it would also be difficult for you to actually make yourself do it. again because of the negative repercussions or the sacrifices that you might have to make. But primarily, what characterizes an ethical dilemma is knowledge. Specifically, what makes an ethical dilemma difficult is that you may not even know what the right thing to do is. And the reason you may not know what the right thing to do is isn't because you don't know all the facts of the case. It's not because you're uneducated from a moral point of view. It's not because you can't reason correctly. We can imagine someone who is an excellent reasoner, who studied ethics, who knows everything there is to know about the case, and who's thought very carefully about the situation, and could still be left at the end of the day saying to themselves, I'm really lost and still indecisive about what should be done here. This person might say, I can see both sides of the issue, both choices presented seem to have strong points in their favor, and no matter what I do, I'm going to have to sacrifice something. There is no perfect option. It is that inability to come to a decision, to know what the morally right thing to do is, that is primarily what characterizes an ethical dilemma as opposed to a moral one. In order to gain a better understanding of what an ethical dilemma is, we're going to again turn to one of the cases that is discussed in our textbook, and this is the Vlasovic case. So I'm going to read through this and then make a few comments on it. Okay, so Peter and Dora Vlasovic, 51 years and 43 years of age respectively, are at a loss as to what to do about Dora's 67-year-old mother, who lives with them. She's suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and while her periods of confusion are not yet continual, she's becoming too unreliable to be left alone. Both husband and wife work outside the house and cannot stay with mother during the day. They started looking into appropriate nursing homes, but mother, who is a school teacher and fiercely independent all her life, has put her foot down. No homes. Look, you know how valuable my mind and my dignity have been to me, she finally said to them. I simply cannot endure the thought of ending my days tied in a chair, drooling on my lap. See that pillow on my bed? When I can't function anymore, my life is over as far as I'm concerned, and I want you to just put that pillow over my face and sit on it for about 20 minutes. Just call the doctor in the morning and say I died in my sleep. I won't contradict you. No homes. Meanwhile, the couple has found out that the cost of these homes is well beyond their means, and that mother will be left on Medicaid after her assets are gone. Their own assets are not large, and they would be totally responsible for the costs if they hired nurses to come to the house to take care of her. They also have teenage children approaching college to think about, who will need money for college and probably financial help as young adults after their education is finished. How did people used to handle this type of situation before there were nursing homes? Dora had once asked her doctor. Easy, he had replied. People didn't used to live this long, and when they did, in this state with no other choice in the matter, people simply left them home alone, tied down or roaming wherever they wanted to roam. That did sound easy to Dora, but on balance worse than the other alternatives. They have the house to think of too, and leaving mother alone all day sounds like playing Russian roulette with house and mother both. But their first concern is for mother. The life projected for her does not really seem to be worth living the more they think about it. Putting a pillow over her face is a dreadful thought, of course, but it is what mother wants, and if they can't face the pillow, the Hemlock Society advertises many more humane ways to bring life to an end. Should they go the pillow route? Should they explore the rational suicide alternatives with mother? Or should they insist on the home or put her there anyway after she is no longer organized enough to resist? Or should they devastate their own financial resources with hired nurses? Are there other alternatives? The reason I bring this case up here is because it provides an excellent example of an ethical dilemma. And the reason it provides an excellent example of an ethical dilemma is, as we're going to see, there are many conflicts of values. There are many fundamental moral and ethical values that almost anyone would think are important and are worth upholding, but that come into conflict with one another. And because they come into conflict with one another, no matter what we choose, we're going to have to sacrifice something of importance. In order to demonstrate this to you, I'm going to identify 4 different types of ethical conflict, 4 different conflicts of values in this case, and discuss them separately. The first one is the following. There's the question of what constitutes a life worth living. Is it merely the quantity of one's life, how much life they have, or more fundamentally, is it the quality of our life that makes our life worth living? It's an important question to answer when we start to think about what is the value of mother's life to her at this point going and also going into the future. Second, we're going to see that there is a conflict in this case between the values of promoting welfare, doing what is best for everyone involved, and respecting the autonomous choice of mother. In addition, we're going to see that when it comes to respecting autonomous choice, there is also a conflict between that and upholding certain inviolable or very important traditional moral prohibitions in society. Specifically, perhaps the traditional prohibition on voluntary homicide. How do we both respect mother's wishes and respect her autonomy while also not running afoul of the law and not running afoul of any very important, extremely fundamental, absolute moral rules? And finally, there's a fourth conflict to consider as well. How do we sort out the different familial duties that the Vlasovics have in this case? How do we weigh the duties that they have to mother, the duties they have to a parent, versus the duties that they have to their own children? Must a sacrifice be made here? These are the four different conflicts of values that I will look at in this video pertaining to this case. One reason that cases like this are so difficult is that they really force us to think about some deep and difficult philosophical questions. They really force us to think about what is life all about? What is life for? What makes life valuable? And we can see this in the following passage from the case. So Newton describes the Vlasovics reflecting in the following manner. Their first concern is for mother, but the life projected for her does not really seem to be worth living the more they think about it. Now, I think that's a very striking phrase. The phrase, a life worth living. Why is that such a striking phrase? Well, think about what it implies. The concept of a life worth living also implies the possibility of a life not worth living. It implies the possibility of an existence where continuing or further that existence would not be a benefit to the individual in question, but would actually be a harm. And if that is the case, then that means that merely knowing that someone is alive or will be alive isn't necessarily enough for us to conclude that their life is a good thing for them. Now, why does this matter in this particular case? Well, Mother herself has brought up the possibility of having her life ended through various different means. And some of those means will be important to us, and we'll discuss those later in the video. But here I just want to focus on the idea of that request itself. If we're bringing up the possibility that of Mother ending her life or having her life ended, then we really have to think about the question, what is it that makes a person's life worth living? How do we know whether someone's life is going well or whether someone's life is going poorly? How do we make a judgment about the value of a life? Well, what I would want to suggest is that there's really two different main considerations here. On the one hand, we might have a consideration dealing with quantity. We might say that when judging the value of a life, we need to consider how long that life will last or has lasted. So this is relatively commonsensical in a way. You might say, look, if we're looking at the whole span of someone's life and we're considering two individuals, both of whom had roughly the same level of enjoyment, the life that lasted longer would seem to be better, right? More of a good thing up to a certain point is better than less of a good thing. So there are quantity considerations here. But even in that example I gave, I also mentioned another consideration, and that is the consideration of the quality of a life. When we're judging the quality of a life, we won't just look at quantity or how much of it there is, but we'll also think about how good is each moment of that life, or how good are all the moments of that life taken together on average. Right, so when judging the value of a life, we need to consider the quality of life it affords the individual in question. Now, of course, this is more difficult to measure, right? In terms of quantity of life, you just measure in terms of days or months or years, seconds, right? Some unit of time that we've all agreed upon. When we're talking about the quality of someone's life or how valuable each moment is, that'll be more difficult because there are many different ways you can measure that. You can measure it in terms of happiness, pleasure. Are you getting your desires satisfied? Are you having opportunities for new and interesting experiences? Are you attaining moral virtue? Are you achieving your career and material successes that you're striving after? All of these could be valid and acceptable ways of measuring the value of a person's life. So I'm not going to get into the different philosophical debates about what is the best way to measure the quality of a life. I just want to point out here that both of these considerations seem relevant. And in fact, if we look further into, for instance, a medical context, we can see that the conflicts and relationships between these two different ways of measuring the value of a life often come up. So, some researchers who were doing studies on cancer patients made the following broad statement about how these two considerations, the role that they play in the life of a cancer patient. The researchers say trade offs between quality of life and length of life are often necessary in decision making in oncology. It is acknowledged increasingly that in this process of weighing the benefits and side effects of treatment, the patient's perspective is of prime concern. So, the issue that the patients are thinking about is to what extent do they want to pursue treatment for their cancer, or at what point will it no longer be a benefit? And as they describe, we can see considerations of quantity and quality both playing a role. Some patients are willing to go to extreme lengths to prolong survival, accepting treatments that severely impair quality of life. Other patients feel that they want to make the most of their remaining years and are unwilling to risk an inferior quality of life. So we can see that both considerations seem valid, both seem acceptable, and different people will weigh these differently. The question we're faced with here is, how should we weigh these considerations in this case? Are they inevitably led into conflict? So the question we are faced with now is the following. What is more important when judging the value of our life? Is it the quantity of life we have, or is it the quality of life we have? And what makes a quality or valuable life? And I think an important example we can look to here to begin to answer this question is the example of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. Now, why do I say he's a good person to look to in this instance? Because Socrates was someone who directly confronted the following question: is there anything worth dying for? Now, just a brief background to help us understand the points I want to make. Socrates is famous because he was ultimately put to death by the city of Athens. He was on trial in Athens for the crimes of inventing new gods and corrupting the youth. And ultimately, he was executed by the city. Now, what's interesting is that we have a record of the speech he gave at trial, and that record is in a dialogue written by his student Plato, which is called the Apology. And in that speech he makes to the trial, what he tells us is essentially that the jury has made him the following offer. The idea is that if he would stop practicing philosophy, if he would stop going around the city of Athens, bothering people and pestering people and forcing them to confront their own inadequacies and answer difficult philosophical questions, if he would stop all that, then they would let him live. But what we see from Socrates is complete and total defiance. He refuses to give up on his principles even when he knows that continuing to practice philosophy, not agreeing to cease his practice of philosophy, will actually lead to his death. And I just want to point to a few passages here where Socrates makes this point to the jury. So in one place he says, "You're not thinking straight, sir, if you think that a man who's any use at all should give any opposing weight to the risk of living or dying, instead of looking to this alone whenever he does anything, whether his actions are just or unjust, the deeds of a good or bad man." Here we see a concern that is very much about the quality of one's life, right? He's saying it doesn't matter if I die or if I continue to live, if the only way I can continue to live is by being a vicious person who does bad things. For Socrates, having an upright and upstanding and virtuous moral character is more important to him than living a longer amount of time. And another very famous passage, he says, but again, if I say it's the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day, and the other things you've heard me discussing and examining myself and others about, on the grounds that the unexamined life isn't worth living for a human being, you'll believe me even less when I say that. And there's that striking phrase again, the idea of a life worth living. And what is Socrates saying here? He's saying, yes, maybe I could agree to stop philosophy and that would please the jury and that I would be allowed to continue living and have a larger quantity of life. But it wouldn't be worth it. Because to stop practicing philosophy would be to stop living an examined life. And by that, he just means a life where we think about our commitments, we think about what is just, we think about what is good, and we apply our critical faculties to the question of how we should live. And to Socrates, that just is what it means to practice philosophy. So for him to agree to what the jury is saying, for him to stop practicing philosophy in order to keep on living, would mean he would have to give up to give up living an examined life. And for Socrates, that would mean to give up a life that is worthy of a human being. Human beings have these rational and critical faculties to think deeply about our lives, and if the only way I can continue to live is to give up those, then what would be the point? Again, another consideration which puts the quality of our life above the quantity. And finally, he makes a similar point when he says, "You see, whether in trial or in a war, neither I nor anyone else should contrive to escape death at all costs. Escaping villainy is much more difficult. There just are certain things that are more important than dying. There's some things that are worth dying for. And if the only way, in Socrates' view, that he can continue to live is to sacrifice virtue, to sacrifice his commitment to philosophy, to sacrifice his commitment to an examined life, then in his view, such a life simply would not be worth living." Now, you might take issue with the fundamental importance that Socrates places on philosophy. You might think, well, maybe that's not really a value that all human beings need to value just in the way Socrates does. Maybe that's more personal to him. And that's a discussion you can have. But the broader point is this: if you think that there are some principles, some values, and commitments which make your life worth living into the future, if there is something your life is about, if your life has some sort of purpose, then you really need to think carefully about whether it would be worth it to extend your life in a way that would force you to undermine those commitments. And in fact, we see exactly that point in this case. Now, Mother is not a philosopher. She's not talking about the importance of living an examined life oriented toward discussions about virtue. But she certainly has some commitments that she thinks make her life worth living and seem to be important enough to her that she would be willing to end her life early if she could no longer have those things. And so here we should highlight the following part of the case once again. They started looking into appropriate nursing homes, but Mother, who was a school teacher and fiercely independent all her life, has put her foot down. No homes. Look, you know how valuable my mind and my dignity have been to me. I simply cannot endure the thought of ending my days tied in a chair drooling on my lap. Now, what is the overall point here? She's thinking about her entire life where she's been a fiercely independent person. She had purpose. She was able to do things on her own. She was able to go where she wanted to go. She was able to do the things that she found fulfilling and have her integrity intact, knowing that she had her personal autonomy. Now she's tragically staring in the face the possibility of a life where those things are gone, where she no longer has the freedom to move about and go where she wants and go where she chooses, where she no longer can live her fiercely independent lifestyle. And so we can see that just like Socrates, there is a quality of life consideration here that is really making her consider, would it be worth it for me to continue to extend my life, to continue to live on in the future? Or can I only live on in the future in a way I wouldn't recognize, in a life that would feel foreign or alien to me? Now, all of this brings up a very important further question. I think we can understand why Mother reacted negatively to the idea of living in a home. She's reacting negatively to the thought of living a life that she doesn't recognize for herself, that seems very different from the life she used to live and the kind of life she would want to live. So, all of that is understandable. At the same time, however, we might wonder, should we trust her self assessment of how valuable her life would be in a home? When Mother says that her life would simply not be worth living if she had to live in a home, is that a judgment that we should trust, or is it one that we should push and maybe seek to override? There are a couple facts we need to keep in mind. Mother is in a very difficult situation. She's likely approaching the end of her life, likely under a lot of stress, and also, of course, is an Alzheimer's patient. And all of these factors should contribute to us asking the question, is she in the appropriate and competent mental state to actually judge the quality of her life? Is she so scared about losing a life she used to live that she can't see that although there will be aspects of her new life and new existence which won't be the most desirable, that there could be many positive elements as well that she's simply overlooking? And this provides a further complication here. She seems to suggest that her quality of life in a home would be so low that life would not be worth living, but we really do need to wonder, is she in an appropriate position to make that very serious and important judgment? One thing that Noon emphasizes as being very important is that when we're facing an ethical dilemma, we need to define the dilemma we're facing very distinctly and clearly. And here's how she defines the dilemma in the Vlasovic case. In the Vlasovic case, the dilemma is painfully evident. How to ensure Mother's and the family's welfare while respecting Mother's choices and the most serious rules of our society, while allocating the family's not abundant resources justly among the generations that will call upon them. I use this description because it brings out many of the further conflicts that we need to discuss. And as I've highlighted in red here, there's another further conflict between how do we ensure and promote welfare and how do we respect autonomy and individual choice. And let's look at this section of the case again. So they have this choice. Should they insist on the home or put Mother there anyway after she's no longer organized enough to resist? Or should they devastate their own financial resources with hired nurses? And here we have a conflict, it seems, between, on the one hand, respect for autonomy, and the other, promotion of welfare. So, what do these two commitments mean? Well, respect for autonomy is essentially a moral duty by which we need to respect the choices of other people. We need to respect the free choices of individuals to live their lives according to their own desires, goals, values, and priorities. We think that people should be treated with the sort of special status they have as rational, independent decision makers. And because we have this ability for free choice, the idea is that it's at least initially morally wrong to override that free choice. We have to accept that people have different goals, different priorities, different values, and we show respect for that by allowing people to act on those priorities and make their own decisions. That's respect for autonomy. But this can often conflict with promotion of welfare. The idea behind promotion of welfare is very similar to the idea of utilitarianism that we discussed earlier. It's a moral duty to act in a way that serves the best interest of all parties involved. When you're concerned with promotional welfare, you are concerned with questions like how do I make the most amount of people happy? How do I serve the interests of the largest number of individuals? So, all would agree that these two values, respect for autonomy and promotional welfare, are important. But in this case, they seem to conflict. Why is that? Well, on the one hand, we might say, well, we need to respect mother's autonomy. But of course, her free choice, the choice she has made, the decision she wants, is a decision where she doesn't end up in a home. And if we do that, then of course the only other alternative that we're considering at this point would be to hire nurses to come and take care of her. And you might say, well, how does that conflict with promotion of welfare? Well, as Newton explains, the resources of the family are limited, they don't have a ton of money, and hiring the nurses would very much deplete their financial resources. And not only are they calling on those resources now, but as she explains, the Vlasovic's children may need those resources in the future. It seems if we take a broad overall perspective of accounting and trying to serve the interests of everyone involved, then doing that would require mothers staying at a home, which is more economical, and having those resources available for everyone else. But of course, the only way we can do that is by overriding mother's free choice, by failing to respect her autonomy, by saying, although you don't want to go in a home, it is necessary that you do this, perhaps against your own will in some sense, for the greater good of the whole. Now, here we see a clear case where it seems like we can only respect autonomy by not promoting overall welfare, and only promote overall welfare by not respecting autonomy. Something has to be sacrificed. It doesn't seem that we can have both. If one of our primary moral concerns is respecting mother's autonomy, then of course there's another option that she put on the table. She expressed the belief that a life in a home simply wouldn't be worth living. She's expressed the belief that she would prefer actually to die than go on living in a way where she'd have to sacrifice her independence. And so she tells the Vlasovics that if they simply cannot care for her any other way than a home, then she would prefer that they assist her in ending her life. And of course, she puts this in a rather sort of drastic, violent, and visceral way. Putting a pillow over her face is a dreadful thought, of course, but it is what mother wants, or at least claims to want. And if they can't face the pillow, the Hemlock Society advertises many more humane ways to bring life to an end. And this statement brings up another potential conflict between competing moral values. On the one hand, again, we have respect for autonomy. To whatever degree we think that mother is still capable of autonomous choice at this point, she has expressed the desire potentially to have her life ended. But that would seem to conflict with certain traditional, moral, and even legal prohibitions. In this case, potentially the traditional prohibition of homicide. And what is this? It is always morally wrong to kill another innocent human being. This is a bedrock moral principle, not really just of our morals and ethics, but of our legal system as well. And it's seen as one of the most important ethical values and moral rules in society. So again, we seem to be locked in this conflict. To give mother what she wants, to respect her autonomy by assisting her in ending her life early, it seems we also have to violate this traditional prohibition on homicide. Now, there are many complications here. Again, is mother a competent decision maker? What do we mean by homicide? But let's put those aside for a moment. There are a few points to make. First, if we think about this case in particular, it's very unlikely that the choice to deliberately end mother's life would be appropriate. And in part, that is simply because mother is not in a position where she can truly consent to such a drastic choice. Again, she's an Alzheimer's patient. She is facing serious and drastic changes in her life circumstances. Not all her mental faculties seem to be intact at this point. So to acquiesce in that request would seemingly not be permissible even by those who most ardently support the right to choose how and when we will die. However, putting that aside, we should notice that aside from this case in particular, this is a more general ethical, moral, and legal problem. There are individuals who are competent decision makers, who look at their life prospects, who don't see a life worth living, and have made a rational judgment that they would prefer to not continue living on. However, they don't have the means to end their life themselves, and so sometimes they will request the help of a medical professional or someone they know. They'll request help in having their life ended. So I can't get into all the particularities of that conflict here, but we should simply notice that this is a real moral and ethical conflict, and it is a situation in which we can't do everything we want to do. We want to respect the autonomy of the patient. We also want to uphold the traditional prohibition on homicide, and it's difficult to see how those two things can be squared in all cases of this sort. The final ethical conflict that I want to consider in this case is a conflict between two different types of familial duties. That is, two different types of duties that we have toward family members. And that is specifically the duties we have to our parents and then the duties that we have to our children. So let's say a few things about each one of these first. First, the duty we have to our parents. This is a moral duty to support one's parents that can generally be classified as a type of loyalty motivated by gratitude. Right? So why loyalty? Well, you don't choose your parents. You are born to them. Right? It's not a matter of choice. It's not a matter of your own free will. You're thrown into this world with a set of two individuals who are your biological parents. And that's not up to you. But presuming that they were there for you throughout your life, that they supported you, that they raised you, that they gave you what you needed to get to where you are today, at some point the tables turn. And the gratitude that you have for everything your parents have done for you when you were vulnerable, when you needed, when you were a child and couldn't make your own decisions and couldn't support yourself, those tables are turned when your parents are older. And now, of course, it is on you as the child to support your parents out of a sense of loyalty and gratitude for the things that they have done for you. So, this is the basis between the common idea that there is a duty to support our parents. At the same time, there's also, of course, a duty to support our children. It's a moral duty to support our children that can be classified as a duty of care, uniquely taken on by parents that is motivated by love. The basis of a duty to our children is found in the fact that no one else can serve the sort of purpose that a parent does in a child's life. Whether biological or adoptive, whoever primarily is responsible for raising that child, giving the child what it needs, making decisions for the child, takes on a unique role in that individual's life. And not only do we think that there should be someone with that unique role in the child's life, who is responsible for caring for that child, we think it should be motivated by love, out of a concern for what's best for the child, out of a desire to see the child flourish. So this is the basis of these two different familial duties, two different kinds of duties we have to family members. How exactly do these conflict? Well, once again, we can see how the duty to a parent comes into play here. We might say, well, it's rather harsh to put mother in a home when that's really not where she wants to go. Given all the things that she did for the Vlasovics when they were growing up, given everything that she did for her children, we might say it would be cruel, harsh, or maybe even disloyal, or maybe lacking in gratitude to now turn their backs on her and to say, well, even though we know that putting you in a home will radically alter your independence, radically alter your self-conception, that we're going to give you off to someone else to take care of you. A person could argue that that is to violate the duty to one's parents. But of course, as we've explained, the only way that the parent, mother in this case, can be cared for is by taking on a significant financial burden with having nurses come to the home. And this might infringe upon the duty to one's children. We already said those financial resources may be needed so the children can go to college, so that they can have a good start in life, and so the children can flourish. And this is, of course, something that any parent is concerned about and that we think parents have a responsibility to be concerned about. So once again, we have a very difficult conflict of ethical duties or ethical values. We all think it's important to support parents. We all think it's important that parents support their children. Yet in this case, it simply doesn't seem that we can do both. It seems that no matter what we choose, something has to be sacrificed. The way I would like to end this video could be in a way that some would find anticlimactic. I've laid out all these different ethical conflicts in the Vlasovic case. I've suggested how there are fundamental moral values at stake, and no matter what choice we make, we'll have to sacrifice something important to us. And what you might want now is for me to come out and tell you, well, here is the right answer. Here's the way that you make a choice in the decision that preserves all the important moral values that we want. But of course, I don't have that for you. And in fact, I think that's largely because I don't think that's possible. One of the main things I hope you've gotten from this discussion is not necessarily what the right thing to do is in this case, but a recognition or a realization of the fact that moral life and ethical life can be difficult and messy. There's often not a clear right answer. There's often not a clear choice of what should be done. And because that is the case, there's a further point that needs to be made. Because there are competing ethical values, because people will prioritize those values differently, people will respond to the same scenario in very different ways. Some people will think respecting autonomy is more important than welfare in this case. Some will think the opposite. Some will think that life itself is valuable and as much quantity of life as we can get should be preserved. Others will think that quality of life is really what matters. People who are intelligent, who are reasonable, who are informed about ethics and all the facts of the case can look at the same situation and come to different conclusions about how to resolve all the conflicts that I presented in this video. So, what does that mean for us? What does that mean fundamentally for how we should respond to someone who looks at this case and comes to a different conclusion? I would suggest it means we should respond in the following way. We shouldn't necessarily give up on the idea that there is a right answer or a family of right things to do. We shouldn't give up on the idea that there are better and worse choices just because people see things differently. But once you understand how difficult the choice is in these kinds of cases, once you understand how deep the conflicts go in an ethical dilemma, I think one thing it can give you is a sense of humility and understanding. Instead of blaming those who disagree with you, instead of finding those who come to a different outcome as being fundamentally wrong-headed, even evil or morally deficient, what you should conclude is this is a very difficult situation. I can see how there are fundamental moral values that others might prioritize over the ones I prioritize, and I can completely understand how someone could come to a different conclusion. And I think if you take away nothing else from this discussion, that might be the most important point. Because there's a tendency in ethical discussions to think that whatever answer I've arrived at, whatever values I place as the highest, must in fact be the only conclusion a reasonable person can draw. But of course, that just is a recipe for conflict. It's a recipe for misunderstanding. It's a recipe for distrust of our fellow human beings. Because if we don't think it's reasonable to come to an opposite conclusion, then we can only conclude that there must be something fundamentally wrong with how the other person's looking at this scenario. But if you accept that these decisions are difficult, if you accept that some sacrifice has to be made, and if you accept that some people might elect to make a different sacrifice of moral values than you might elect to make, then I think overall that can bring us to a better level of understanding and a better place of seeing the common humanity in those who disagree with us.